Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the warm welcome. This is the panel on the Digital Services Act, the DSA. That's true. And I'm very happy that you are interested in a small round on platform regulation. And of course, for me, it is a topic close to my heart because I research on it and I sometimes write for Spiegel magazine on this issue. But this is not what we're going to talk about. It's going to be about the basic law or constitution for the Internet, as it is often termed, because together with its sister regulation, I have an echo in my ear now, says the speaker and the interpreter. And now it's gone, but there is a bit of a noise. Okay, there is no sound. Okay, Mr. Müller will be joining us acoustically in a while. Anyway, DSA and DMA are the sister regulations and the largest regulations on the digital in the EU for more than 20 years. And to just briefly tell them apart, the DSA is mainly linked to the influence that digital platforms and communication services have on us users and on their content, on the content we post. So the ways that Facebook deletes posts or blocks accounts, how Twitter can use my data, and the platforms, how they deal with illegal content. And the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, will more be about the economic perspective. That is how Amazon should treat its sellers, what apps can be pre-installed on the smartphone, things like that. So together with you, I am going to try to look at the DSA, what new stuff it brings, and what it brings for users, and we are going to learn the difficult points. And now that we have these new rules, how are they going to be implemented is something we will ask. And when I say we, I'm talking about my 5 guests because I will soon stop talking and listen, and I'm going to introduce these 5 to you. I'll start at the other end of the stage, which gives me a time for an audio check. He does hear me. Klaus Müller is the president of the German Network Agency, somewhat the highest regulator for infrastructures of all kind, and he joins us from Bonn. Hello, greetings to the Rhine River. Well, we can't hear him yet. I can hear you. Welcome, greetings from the Rhine to the Spree River in Berlin. Okay, we can hear you now too. And next to you, we have Susanne Dehme. She's the head of the Bitkom Industry Association on Law and Security, and she's the voice for the Digital Society. Thank you for being with us. Next to her, we have Eva Flecken from the media agency of the German Federal States of Berlin and Brandenburg, and she has been overseeing digital platforms for a while, not according to the DSA, but according to German media law. Welcome, Ms. Flecken. Then we have Alexander Gese, member of the European Parliament, as a member of the Green Parliamentary Party, and she is the shadow rapporteur on the Digital Services Act, so she was part of all the negotiations. She is the expert on the DSA. Alexander, thank you for joining us from Brussels. And next to me, Markus Beckedahl, co-founder of the Republica, and for a long time he is the chief editor, one of the chief editors of Netzpolitik.org, and a co-founder, and he's an important voice for civil society. So thank you for the Republica, Markus, and nice that you can hear with us. You can be here with us too. Great. Now, to get us into the subject, I'd like to start with you, Alexander, because you followed the DSA and its development from the start. You negotiated it. And what are, from your point of view, the highlights of the Digital Services Act? So why are you going to vote for the current version of it? Thank you for that question, and hello to you all. So what are the highlights? First of all, the highlight is that it actually exists, because for a time this narrative has gone through the large platforms that went, okay, we'll make our own decisions, and democratic governments won't have a say with their legislation. And with the DSA, we clearly say, no, it is the democratic governments that decide together what the legal framework should be, especially regarding the platforms that are so relevant for democracy, like the ones that we are regulating now. And the second important item, Torben, what you said, is we have Europe-wide clear rules for the way that illegal content should be dealt with, but for the first time across Europe, you also have clear users' rights. It's no longer going to be possible to simply arbitrarily delete posts or block accounts without we as users having a chance to fight back. And there is a multi-stage process for that that gives us definitive rights. And what I also find important is that there was a strong thinking about the business models. So we moved away from this narrative that the internet is problematic. Many of us who think the internet is a great thing found that a difficult debate. So the narrative that only censorship could regulate this, that has changed. And we've looked at business models, which is all very much about personalized advertising, profiling, and enormous intrusions into our privacy. And we've started to kind of construct some initial guidelines. So how can data such as sexual orientation and others be used in profiles to influence the advertising we see? And data from children and minors can no longer be used for that either. But there is a debate not just about the technology, but the business models. That is important, although we haven't only made a start. And the other important issue is that it's not the individual's rights that we are focusing on, but also the actual influence on society that these platforms have. It forces us to do risk assessments on how the way these platforms works, their algorithms, their business models, how that affects certain phenomena in society, whether they are risks to basic rights, human dignity, whether it impacts violence against women, protection of minors, and there are independent assessments. And finally, there is access to the data by platforms for independent research, whether it's started by the Commission or by research institutions, universities, but also researchers in civil society organizations. And with that, we remove this asymmetry, this imbalance of information of what they know about us and we not knowing anything about the platforms. We can gain knowledge now, and we can have evidence-based politics in the future, and we can tell the stories to create public awareness too. That's a huge mix, a whole bunch of various things, and you have had intense negotiations long into nights. And is there anything where we'd say these are open issues where we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve? Well, surely the issue of advertising is where I would have liked a complete prohibition on advertising that is based on monitoring, on surveillance, based on these huge profiles that are communicated through the net in the background, which is economically interesting for us in Europe too, because the monopoly in the advertising industry is held by Google and Facebook. We would have been able to break that. And when it comes to consent, the automatic signals in the browser, it would have been good if you could just have set your browser to say, I don't want any of this in general. That would have been great successes that didn't work out, that we didn't achieve, and we would have wished for more guarantees on reporting to make sure that those affected by hatred could anonymously report. This has become part of the recitals in the regulation, but it's not very clear. We would have liked more clarity on that, the right on anonymity under all circumstances. Personally, I fought for something that was not uncontroversial, that was about porn platforms. I wanted to achieve better protections for women that are affected by illegal image material on porn platforms. Sadly, that hasn't made it into the regulation. So there were a lot of things that could have been regulated better, more clearly, but and there is a threat that we are going to enter into long legal battles about certain articles to stall the implementation, but it's a great success that we've had this basic framework now, that we've agreed on that. Good. Markus, from your perspective, would you share this view on the DSA, that it's a great thing in principle, and regarding the details, we would we'll have to see that the courts are not going to be involved with them for years and years. What's your view? Well, with every law, surely the courts will get busy for a long time, especially when the economic interests are so large. We'll have to see about that. The problem for us as outsiders is that we don't quite know yet what was actually agreed upon, and that is a big problem. Because, of course, there is this trilogue procedure between the European Parliament, the Commission, and the Council at the EU, where at the last minutes, new demands, as far as we can tell, were introduced. Certain lobby groups tried to influence these backdoor negotiations in an intransparent way. And for 1.5 months, we have this political agreement that we've all read about in the media. We have some extracts from what has been resolved, but for 1.5 months now, this is transformed into a legal format. Texts are being written, and what are these texts will actually say in the end? That will be interesting. But what Alexandra said is actually very much what civil society has always called for in this process. We didn't expect as much as that seems to have come out. We would have wished for more in the process. Its progress isn't yet that basic law for platforms, as Ursula von der Leyen has claimed it to be, but at least it stops the regulation holiday that Google and Facebook have enjoyed, who were able to do what they want while everyone just optimized their Facebook pages for the next election campaign. You talked about the process towards the agreement, and that was a very quick process, wasn't it? Particularly for at a European comparison. The Commission put forward the proposal this year, and the political agreement has been reached. We don't have the details, that's true, but the tick mark has kind of been made. And especially in the digital arena, where we often decry the slowness of state action, is that the new gold standard now? Well, it has ups and downs. It was very fast, I think, as far as I could see, because Macron wanted to have this passed during his presidency, the French presidency. But then there were elections 1 month before the end of the presidency, so they couldn't go to Brussels. So that was the end date. 1 month before the elections, the thing should have been finished. And you can tell more about this. Maybe that was a good or a bad thing in the final negotiations. But it could have been done 5 years earlier, and maybe then 3 years ago we would have had a finished regulation, and some of the problems we've seen maybe would have been solved. If next month or at the end of the summer break we'll have the final vote, then we get to the national implementation. Germany will have to spend 1 or 2 years debating it, and when that all is finished, and when we then finally know how this is going to be put into practice, the regulation holidays for Google and Facebook will continue up to that point. Sounds like a very complicated process, yeah. So the question now is that we have people on the stage here who have been talking about the regulation with the media. Ms. Flecken, you and the other institutions in Germany who are doing oversight have been dealing with this for a long time. We have the Media State Treaty between the German federal state. So the German revolution of media law has been in force for a while. And you're looking at Facebook and Twitter and co. Was the DSA, from your view, actually required, or would it have been enough to say we are using the new state media treaty, looking at the platforms, and do we have the right tools for that? Well, I think without a doubt it was high time that we take the EU Commerce Directive and say this is 20 years old. We do need a new legal framework, and also in the shape of a regulation that is immediately enforced in member states. It's going to be interesting how that plays out in the small detail. And it's true that in large parts the DSA is a good supplement to what we have in German media law. law. With the last novel of reform, we already have far improved user rights regarding transparency rules on intermediaries. The so-called companies, by the way, have to stick to those rules too. And we are now evaluating this. Of course, there are legal proceedings going on. Question whether I'm affected by this new regulation is something that every company will be asking itself. And Markus, you've already talked about the conflicts that we're going to face, but this is perfectly in their right. So the big revolution from a media regulation point of view, someone who's had the state media treaty for a few years as a tool, it's not that clear to see. If I look just at media, of course, as you said, the DSA goes much further. But what's interesting is, and that's not just a theoretical question, it's going to be interesting how this law is going to be enforced, because no law is of any use unless it is enforced. So what is going to be the relationship between these various legal frameworks? We have a directive in force that has been implemented through the Media State Treaty. We have copyright laws. So there are various tools, and it's going to be very interesting how these play together. And second, who is going to do it? You've said it.
Yeah, well, we'll get back to that in a minute. I would stay with the legal regulations for a moment. Because in Germany, the regulations towards Facebook are not really going to be substituted by the DSA, right? We'll see. As a representative of media services, I can't really comment that, but my authority is not the right authority to enforce that. But when it's about media, there should be organization independent from the state. Well, I'll not run into the trap. I'll go on. Susanne, the perspective of the digital business and economy is critical. How do you evaluate that from a European perspective? Is it better because it's easier and the market is bigger? Well, I haven't read the DSA proposal yet, and I would have to review the individual paragraphs, but I'm sure that businesses always like harmonization and like for not everywhere to be different regulations. And on top of that, it's not efficient to put any regulations on top of the existing regulations, because that ensues a bigger risk. So far, internet providers were hardly regulated. So the perspective of the companies is different. They are perceiving themselves as being regulated by different regulations that have similar interests. So, of course, it's important to see which regulations become replaceable. It almost sounds like you're looking forward. Now, digital, there were warnings about restricting the European level and the dangers and risks. Now, the DSA, we can't read it yet, but because of the things that are already known, how do you look at the result without looking at single paragraphs? I think you can say that this is a milestone, definitely, in regulation of platforms. It was wanted politically, that's very clear, to especially heavily regulate bigger platforms more so than the smaller providers, but especially to make a holistic law. And this is what we also were very happy with. Of course, not every regulation will be great from the start. They'll have to prove themselves, and we'll have to see how implementation will progress. That takes us to the second topic. Who defines what the single paragraphs mean? So basically, it's not like companies don't want to be regulated. It's good to know for companies what they can do and what they can't do, because of course most companies want to conform with the law. So of course a clearly defined law helps them. And you have to see that this is a huge rule work, and it's very much leveled. It affects everyone from the network provider up to the big platforms, and there's different regulation levels where bigger companies are regulated more strictly and even banned from certain practices, or certain practices are enforced in order to allow for competition. And we will see how the goals are going to be reached. Well, market regulation is often behind closed doors or behind the camera. Now, we've got Mr. Müller here from the Federal Network Agency. So you regulate communications, the post, the railway network, so basically the veins of our infrastructure. So I hope you excuse my first question. What do you have to do with TikTok, Facebook, and so on? So what is your role in the DSA? Well, if you ask me personally, I've been working in consumer protection for 16 years. So platform economy, platform regulation, ethics commissions, and the consumer management is something I've dealt with a lot, but of course you're talking not about me personally, but the Federal Network Agency. We don't have to do a lot with Facebook or Google, but we have to do with big relevant companies such as Telecom, the telecommunications provider, and our job is to listen to people precisely and help them. So it's, for example, about which kind of telephone advertisement is legal, and we also deal with the Post and other groups. And of course, we also have the European context in mind, and there's the European energy market and telecommunications market, where we have a lot of experience. So before we discuss who does what, is why do we do certain things? And this is in algorithm control, transparency, and there's a lot of potential yet. And we need a legal framework that is not just on paper, but that is actually implemented. And our participants have already underlined that. Do you think there's similarities to other jobs you've done? Facebook, for example, there's court proceedings, and that are dealing with what role does Facebook have in communications. Do you see any similarities? Yeah, definitely. I don't want to make this an economics seminary, but those are markets that are not regulated by offer and demand, but that had different tendencies. Telecom has always been a monopolist. So we've had to implement certain strategies so that that allow for competition in certain sectors. So we have large corporations with monopolist tendencies where we really need to ensure that consumer protection is enforced. We see a lot of development where the principle, the winner takes it all, applies, and where we have to ensure transparency and competition. And we've realized that the market can't regulate everything. And now Europe has taken action. Not everything is regulated perfectly just yet, but it's a big step in the right directions. And I believe that networks and platforms are very similar in their regulation. All right, that opens the perspective to the second part that we've hinted at a lot. So you were talking about tendencies of monopoly. So let's switch to the DMA, where we have interoperability of messenger services. This is a goal. And something similar already exists in the Telecommunication Act. Prerequisites. And what I find very interesting, the Federal Network Agency has a interoperability white paper that was published in last December, and the Federal Cartel Office also published a white paper, and this might give one the impression that DSA and DMA have a lot of hot irons in the fire for regulation. And you're basically the smith saying, okay, this iron is ready now. And so in other words, new regulations for TikTok and Co. in the DSA is one question. The other question is, who will implement those regulations? And if I understand DSA correctly, Alexander, there's a differentiation between online platforms and very big online platforms. And the differentiation also affects the regulation. So why did we do that differentiation? That's a very easy question to answer. Very big platforms with more than 45 million users in Europe, that's the current definition, are regulated by the EU itself, and concerning regulations that only apply to those platforms, such as risk assessment and access to data for research purposes. Those are measures that the EU Commission has the right to order. And the implementation is with the Commission for a good reason, because we learned from the GDPR, where we had a very good law that in different European countries was implemented differently, and where the big platforms all concentrate on a country, that makes it very easy for them to mingle through. And we wanted to prevent that effect, that we have enforcement shopping, where big platforms shop for the country with the least regulations. So the small and medium platforms, because this only affects the big ones, are regulated where they have their seat. So the platforms that are fun to regulate, the Commission takes for itself, and the rest, well, any regulation left for them? Yes, of course. We'll also talk about the implementation questions. authorities. Now the member states are represented, and also the regulatory authorities are represented in the implementation, and it's important that Germany has a strong voice for approaching structural topics and not just focusing on individual contents, but on the whole infrastructure characteristics of the platform. So, Susanne, from your perspective, when going to the European level, how much sense do national regulations make if it's about the big corporate groups?
Das könnte man natürlich überlegen.
Well, you could think about going with the Commission directly, but we have to see what the best implementation strategy can look like. I totally support what Alexandra Geese said, that unified implementation is difficult for whatever reason. In Germany, we've got 16 state authorities. That doesn't make it easier. So whether you can implement everything when the law is written well,
die letzte Interpretation auf der EU-Ebene.
You can actually implement the final interpretation on the EU level. And the common implementation is another question. Now, we don't have that in all sectors. We spoke about content. There's a lot of differences in the member states, where you have to think about how to deal with that and what competencies. Companies can't choose their regulators, but what will be important is that that competencies are within the authorities, so that we can ensure a differentiated view and a differentiated interpretation of laws, and that you have a level playing field for everyone in the end, so that there's not uneven interpretations in the individual member states, and that we have a harmonic implementation and also security of law. Now, you sounded almost sad when you said that companies can't choose their regulators. It's Friday, we're at Republica, it's all good. So if you could pick the German service coordinators, the digital services coordinators, if you could pick those, who would it be? Well, I won't name any concrete person here. Well, there's two here. I'm sitting between all the chairs already. It's important to avoid double responsibilities, and it's important for it to be very clear who's responsible and that it fits the portfolio, so that we don't get into a situation where one authority says this and the other authority says something else, but both have the same competency. So we should bring it down to the core, basically, for the companies.
Okay, then I'll play over the ball to Bonn, to Mr. Müller. Your name wasn't mentioned right now. Why could Ms. Diemel have said that the Federal Network Agency would be the right institution for that? Well, I am also not going to fall into the trap or follow the temptation of naming anyone. That would be overreach. The coalition will find a good solution, but let's talk about how that task can be fulfilled well. We have the GDPR. We have all the data protection authorities in the federal states, and they can say how it should not be done. They have had this experience. Also, Of course, the tasks in the DSA are twofold. There is a coordination task. There is not going to be any country in the EU where all the tasks and all the platforms are in just one hand. That is definitely not going to be the case in Germany. So it is going to be about coordinating these tasks and the way they are understood and carried out. The problems, the formation of intent, that has to be transported both ways, from Brussels to the member states and back. And then there are original tasks that are going to be emanating from the DSA. Dark pattern control, transparency rules, and we will have to deal with the small and medium, the smaller and medium-sized categories on the platforms, and whether there's going to be a uniform approach in the sense of a level playing field, and whether that is going to be possible in the European context. Whoever can do that is going to be predestined to do this. And it has to be done together in the interests of the consumer. That was almost a bit of an application without saying it out loud, but let's deal with the things that you talked about. The Federal Network Agency has had decades of experience in regulating infrastructure, and we've talked about social networks and platforms as a new kind of infrastructure, at least in a symbolic sense, if not in the legal sense. Now, what can we learn from 20 years of German network regulation? You've talked about mistakes that maybe have been done in the field of data protection. So what are the lessons that could be learned from the work that your authority has made? Well, Ms. Demel mentioned an important point. It's about resources and about competencies. The power sector is something that you have to understand. Power, the electricity and gas networks. And we could say the same about all other networks too. So if any agency is not competent and doesn't have the required staffing, then they will not regulate well and not enough. So we need competent authorities that can take part in the conversation at the European level. And also it's going to be about power. We have big economic interests that are at stake, and we can't kind of obey to them out of just the interests of any industry location. So there's going to be a task ahead for the government. We've had the European Court of Justice ruling that regulation hasn't been independent enough, and the German government will going to repair that in this year, and that, I think, is right, because independent regulation is going to be strengthened. We cannot just become the serfs of any politically minded German government. We have to be independent. And we have to have a clear mandate for a competition in consumer protection. So these are three lessons that we need to learn from 20 years of experience, and that in the platform economy are going to be just as relevant as in the energy and telecommunications sector. Yeah, that is understandable. Oh, there's a bit of applause. So courage, competency, independence. Ms. Flecken, these must be your keywords, right? My question would be, are you still interested in sitting at this minor table, the National Middle Service Coordinator role that you seem to have when the large issues are going to be done by the Commission itself? So should the regional media authorities get involved? Well, I'm very sad about the charming kind of restraint that Mr. Miller has displayed. I have to hold an application speech now, and the regional media authorities have been in place for 30 years, and they haven't aged in those 30 years, just to get that image away from the table. So, because in these 30 years, we have had this systematic decisions in regulation. We've been doing this. And it's not the case that the state media authorities only become active when a certain violation happens on the media and a very small decision has to be made. No, especially in the field of platform regulation, which has been in German media law for years with different foundations. But the systematic questions of open access, the absence of discrimination. These are all questions that have now been anchored in the DSA, which is very true. But it's nothing that is alien to German media law. So I'm very happy that we as media authorities, well, we may not have the competency to do telecommunications regulation. The term competency has been used several times. And there's this general political debate, not here on the panel maybe, is that the distribution of tasks is something that is, that question is simply elegantly ignored. We need we need to think in a systematic and large scale. And we need to ask, do we have institutions that are independent of the state and independently financed too? The European sister organizations and member states have different structures. So I believe that we have good reason, as we've seen in the last few months, we have good reason to be organized in the way we are. So I believe that a lot can be done hand in hand with all the different regulatory authorities. I'm sure that I understand that digital economy representatives say there should not be chaos, but I think there won't be chaos. I think it can be delineated quite easily, and the fact that the German voice is more than one voice, that is something that the other member states have got used to for a long time now. Regarding that concept of different voices, it is what Julian Jaus from the Stiftung Verantwortung, Foundation Responsibility, has posed. There is an interactive format that you can use there. So he listed all the institutions that are regulating that could be regulating authorities, and he found 11 of them. And the media authorities are one of these 11. But you have 14 various authorities in the various federal states. And regarding data protection, isn't that a difficult situation where you have to use the federal system in Germany and find an agreement all over Germany? Not at all. I can put your worries at rest because we have the coordination there, and all cases that are relevant across Germany, we have the coordinating body called ZAK. And regarding these nationwide questions, that is where decisions are made, and they are made quickly. Maybe not all unanimously, but that's not really necessary. There is a discourse as opinions are formed, which is good. And regarding access to those platforms, I think we have a very good system of checks and balances. At the end, there is the Commission that resolves, and that these decisions then have to be implemented by all state regulation authorities. So we are quick. Okay, now I have to reveal something because there are two colleagues on the panel here. Mrs. Flecken, you are the director of the Media Board for Berlin and Brandenburg, and Markus, you are in the advisory council of the very same Media Board for the states of Berlin and Brandenburg. And that means that you have the outside view as well as the inside view on the processes and decisions of the state media authorities. So are they well suited, in your view, to conduct media regulation, as Ms. Flecken says? Well, my view is slightly different, and my position as an perhaps outsider with a slight inside perspective, I often feel that the state media authorities should stick with the original task they had, and that is to regulate the media, and that is the classical media, not the infrastructures, not the platforms, because they don't have the resources for that. There are many committees, many state media authorities that have their own individual competencies, which again they carry into various committees. And that is not at the same level as the other side. And to regulate the large or medium-sized platforms, and you've mentioned various criteria. So you have distance, independence from the state. And this is interesting because DSA and DMA, as far as I know so far,
Das kannst du gleich mal erklären.
You can tell us, Alexandra, these large platforms are to pay half a percent of their revenue to create these supervising authorities. So we would have financing independent of the state. But the question, of course, then would be, where does that money go? And we have two problems there, I think. At the EU level, is it going to be the Commission that does this? That used to be the way we do things. Commissioner Vestager became famous that way because she was motivated in acting against platforms, but we've seen the problem. There was this case when Google were to hand data to the Commission, and the Commission didn't have the infrastructure to actually receive and handle these data. So they were kind of blocked in their work by what they received. And even if the EU Commission would receive 0.5% of the company's revenue and employ data scientists, they are still the executive and the legislative at the same time. And that, from a democratic theory point of view, is too much power in one hand. So it would be better if we were to think about new structures. There are various ideas on digital agencies as a new institution, a new level, where young, motivated people that think digitally could be brought together for an effective, future-proof structure without the ballast of times past. And going back to the national level, we could think in a similar way, because all the platforms have been very successful to kind of surf through the various circumstances. I've seen all these committees, working groups that were created between the regulatory authorities who've said, well, yeah, we somehow have an internet responsibility. And so they met and tried to think, what are we going to do? And the platform said, oh, great, this is going to take a long time, so we're just going to muddle through somehow. And we'll just block everything from happening. So I'm not really convinced that the state media authorities would be the right institutions, or the Federal Network Agency, or the others, up to the customs authorities who are going to be working on fake products on marketplaces. So it would be good if we were to find a courageous new path and create a new digital infrastructure or institution without the ballast and with effective resources.
So before posing a question to Alexandra Gesen, I would like to give Ms. Flecken the opportunity to comment. From my own experience, I know that a lot of motivated people are working in both of your organizations. This is not what Markus was getting at. But, I'll go back in my hammock. It's Friday at 12. So, yeah, I've got one point, and then we can leave it at that. The Media Council does not work with on the federal level. It's only an observer, and there's a lot of proceedings in the coming months, so maybe it isn't so bad. So you're optimistic. I like that. Alexandra Gese, the question to you: when you thought out or proposed the DSA, what was the European perspective on oversight? Because you also live in Bonn, so you're kind of geographically connected to the network agency, right? Yeah, the fact that I also live in Bonn does not influence anything, just to clarify that. But what we wanted, even before DSA was conceived, was an independent EU digital agency. This is a topic we've been treating for a long time. I'm in my first legislative period, so I totally agree with Markus Beckedahl. We introduced that in the parliamentary phase, but there was no majority in the parliament, so that's that. What I hear now, also in the general debate, is that the idea to have a department in the Commission was the predecessor of an independent agency. I think it's the best solution possible to put that into the hands of the European Commission that is very, very competent in platform regulation. I don't know if anywhere else in the world we have public agents who are so well versed in the matter, and you have to acknowledge that. So I think in the leadership circle we have a lot of competencies within the European Union, and I actually trust them to build up an agency that has power and is not just a bureaucratic dinosaur and goes into the direction of what Markus Beckedahl proposed. Then you have the supervision fees that are supposed to cover the costs, but also give us the opportunity to hire high-profile data scientists who don't want to be public servants in the EU at 50 years of age, but really want to get into topics. There's initiatives in the Silicon Valley, for example, that have worked in Google tech teams and who really try to make the platform better and who believe in the capitalist model and see that it's not possible without companies, and went out there and started to work with legislators around the world to make their knowledge available. And this is something I really appreciate, that we would be able to implement, to involve them in this model. And this could be the predecessor, so that you don't have the legislative and the executive organ in the same house, but in a few years we'll be able to say, now's the moment to found an independent agency. The problem in Germany is also that this is a very bureaucratic legal process that needs time, and that should actually be started right now. So I would favor supervision right now, and that shouldn't take long, because in Europe the Commission is already very competent just after a few months after the DSA comes into effect. So I think it will be in the first week of June. So in the beginning of next year, we can already start working with the platforms. So the member states have one more year, but it'll start right now, and we have to start implementing right now. But we will keep working on an independent agency. Thank you very much. So in Bonn, Mr. Müller shrugged or raised his hand. So, just as a means of sharing experience, the Federal Network Agency also regulates the power and gas market. And data scientists are something we've been making good experience with, because we trade power and gas in a stock exchange. And of course, you need regulation there, and you need to ensure that companies don't use and abuse that potential. And we are making use of data scientists. Those are mainly young people who've studied maths, statistical models, and who can use those sciences. And we're seeing changes in agencies that regulate. You can model the market conditions. You can verify that using AI. And I can only underline no matter if it's media services or other bodies, it's important to have the regulators and the regulatees meet on an eye level. Sounds good. Okay, so you just said we can do this. I like this message. Susanna, I would like to ask you, at Bitkom, you work together with politics and you bring in concepts and proposals. So from your experience, how probable is it to imagine a new agency in Germany that unifies politically somewhere in Germany to found that agency? How realistic is that?
Wenn der politische Wille da ist.
So if the political will is there, of course it's feasible. It's always easier to create an authority than to abolish one. It kind of develops an independent life. But I think now is a good time to think about what authority structures do we need for what kinds of tasks of the future, because this problem isn't limited to DSA, DMA. It applies to a lot of other acts, like the Data Act, and other big legal initiatives on the EU level. And of course, the EU competency has its limits, and it has to delegate to the member states. And this is why the member states should think about the strategic implementation in the state authorities. And I think it's important for the states, when there's meddling with their competencies, it's very good to have a structure and not have it run independently. And for other tasks, it's important to have that independence. So there's no absolute right and wrong. It really depends. Other than competency, which we've talked about, also the resources and the manpower to stick through a long proceeding or tackle preventative tasks, and instead of chasing single cases, whether that's present. Yeah, I get that. So there's a lot of potential here. Maybe I want to. I just got the signal that we are nearing the end of our session. If I've learned one thing in the past hour, it's that we've got a basic law for the platforms, but there's a lot of questions still around it. I would like to have one quick final round on this stage, independently of who will be the new German DFC. So who of you do you think has the most exciting job as a stakeholder, but also as a companion maybe, and why? I would be happy about a short statement and self-nomination. So even if you think it's you. So let's start with Marcus. Okay, I'll take you as a scientist to do all the research. Well, one last point. DSA isn't solving the principal problem. There's a core problem with many side effects that we discuss, and we have to tackle that. Okay, someone else has to do that. Alexandra. Well, difficult decision. Mr. Müller and Ms. Flecken with the implementation task. That needs to be powerful, but I would also nominate Markus Beckedahl, because we have the possibilities of research, and you were talking about personalized ads. So Accessing platform data for research has huge potential, and I see civil society to be responsible to take the opportunity, because the more research we can do and the more influences we can prove, the more regulation we can allow for, so that we have a free and democratic internet. Okay, Ms. Flecken, the innovation country North Rhine-Westphalia, that includes myself and Mr. Müller. Düsseldorf has also implemented AI, so well, there's a lot of work. All right, Susanne? Yeah, I would nominate Eva because the challenge of filling the role
Und die Einschätzung aus Bonn.
and our estimation from Bonn. I nominate Alexandra Gese of the European Parliament because after the DSA is before the next regulation, we've heard about the shortcomings, and if there's one competent body, it's the European Parliament. Okay, this was a solid final round. None of you will be bored in the coming months and years, so thank you very much to the round, to Klaus Müller, to Ms. Flecken, to Markus Beckedahl, to Ms. Gese. Thank you very much. And thank you, the audience, for your interest and patience. And at 12:30, we will be talking about liability questions. Have fun at the Republica and on the internet. Stay healthy. See you.